Hey guys, tonight we drift into the shaded corridors and fragrant silence of Heian-era Kyoto, where sleeves sweep tatami mats, where court ladies speak in glances, and where the scent of ink clings to everything like memory. We're following the soft, deliberate footsteps of one of Japan's most famous writers, Murasaki Shikibu, lady of the court, observer of souls, and unintentional inventor of the world's first psychological novel. You're stepping into a world where poetry is currency, diaries whisper more than they shout, and hair is judged by how far it trails behind you. Not metaphorically, but literally. You probably won't survive this. Not because of war or famine, but because this world demands a type of quiet most of us forgot how to hold. Your handwriting would be judged before your thoughts. Your sleeves would be weighed against the season. And your emotions, best expressed with 31 syllables and the right seasonal flower metaphor. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where this sleepy little history channel travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in a misty Kyoto morning, somewhere near the year 978. The air smells like wet wood, plum blossoms, and temple ash. You hear the rhythmic scrape of a broom brushing the edge of a veranda. No one's rushing. Time here moves like lacquer, slow, glossy, deliberate. A young girl crouches behind a screen, brush in hand, copying characters into the margins of her father's Chinese scroll. That's Murasaki. Not her real name, of course. We still don't know that. She's remembered by the name of a flower and the title of her most famous character. A fiction birthed from fiction. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Murasaki Shikibu was born into the prestigious but somewhat faded Fujiwara family, a clan tangled in politics, poetry, and marriage negotiations. Her father, a scholar, lamented more than once that she was smarter than most of his sons, but custom dictated that women weren't meant to study the classics, which, naturally, she did anyway. You trail her through shadowed hallways lit by paper lanterns, her tiny ink-stained hands leaving smudges on her sleeves. She listens more than she speaks, watches more than she's seen. There's a sense that the world is a poem she hasn't finished writing yet. Her mother dies young, her older brother takes the expected path into state service. And Murasaki? She lingers in the margins. She writes, not for fame, not even for audience, just to understand. In this world, everything is ceremony. A woman's beauty lies in the quality of her robes and the subtlety of her voice. Men rise and fall by poetry and family ties, and behind the brocade and bows, a delicate network of personal journals where real thoughts live. You imagine her now, curled on a tatami mat, scratching tiny lines into handmade paper. Her inkstone is chipped, her fingers are stained, her eyes are a little tired, and somewhere behind the curtains, a nightingale calls. Soft, persistent. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Heian Japan, court ladies weren't allowed to speak Chinese in public, but many learned it in private, especially if they came from scholarly households. Murasaki's fluency in Chinese text set her apart, and probably made her simultaneously admired and slightly terrifying to other courtiers. Historians still argue whether her early writings were encouraged or merely tolerated, whether her genius was seen as a novelty, a threat, or a quiet rebellion in silk. But from the way her characters eventually speak, think, and hesitate, you know she understood people better than they understood themselves. You stand beside her now, watching the ink dry. She's just written a line that will someday become part of something much larger. But she doesn't know that yet. She just knows it felt honest. And that's enough. The fog outside thickens, and the girl with the ink-stained sleeves leans into her own story. You linger just a moment longer in the dim quiet of her family home, tucked away behind curtains and latticed screens. The light filters in at sharp angles now, slicing shadows across the floor like brushstrokes. Somewhere, someone laughs softly over a game of Go. But Murasaki isn't playing, she's watching. Even as a child, her world is layered, surface rituals wrapped around deeper undercurrents. She sees how the women speak without saying what they mean. She notices how the men recite poems with practiced melancholy, then shuffle them like playing cards behind closed doors. And you? You follow her into that slow education of glances, textures, silences. She isn't raised to be a writer. She's raised to be invisible in the right ways. Polished, compliant, present, but not disruptive. But somewhere between the ink and the incense, she finds the outlines of characters forming, not court officials or mythic heroes, but flawed people with hesitant hearts. Here's your mainstream fact. Heian-era girls of noble families were educated in music, calligraphy, etiquette, and poetry, intended to attract advantageous marriage, not produce literature. Murasaki's grasp of Chinese literature was both rare and subversive. It gave her a voice in a world where few women were allowed to write, much less publish. You imagine her sneaking peeks at her father's books, copying passages meant for male scholars. She does it without defiance, just quiet conviction. As if to say, if knowledge lives behind these scrolls, I'm not waiting to be invited. She doesn't. She enters. The years pass in hazy rhythm. Seasonal festivals, ceremonial gatherings, the wearing of 12-layered silk robes in the wrong order if you're not careful. Her name isn't written in any records yet, but her mind is already working, softly, slowly, constantly. She studies poems written by dead men and wonders why no one writes about the moments that truly matter. The long waits, the paused confessions, the brush of a sleeve that meant everything. In the garden, the plum blossoms fall. In her mind, someone picks one up and sighs, and she writes it down. Here's your quirky tidbit. Heian women weren't allowed to sign their work openly, so even major literary accomplishments were often attributed to anonymous court ladies. Some scholars believe Murasaki's earliest writings were poems slipped into correspondence or diaries under borrowed names or no name at all. You sit with her one evening, candle flickering beside a dish of powdered incense. She dips her brush into the ink, hesitates, and then begins a line. Not a famous one yet, just a quiet observation. Maybe about the way rainwater pools on a sandal strap, or how longing sounds in someone's footsteps down a distant hall. It's nothing. It's everything. The world won't see her yet, but she sees it. Historians still argue whether her early creativity was escapism or ambition, whether she longed for freedom, fame, or simply a way to survive the deep stillness of her world. But you sense that she never aimed for legacy. She aimed for precision, to write the world exactly as it felt. And it felt like silk damp with memory, like incense curling toward silence, like love unspoken but perfectly known. You leave her there for now, beneath a curtain patterned with chrysanthemum and cloud. She bends again over her page and writes what no one else dares say. That beauty isn't always loud, that sorrow has its own handwriting, and that some women write not to be heard, but so they don't disappear. Section 3. The court is calling. Not yet directly, not by name, but the pull is there. In the letters passed quietly between noble households, in the soft talk over lacquered boxes of plum wine, in the way certain doors are left slightly ajar. Murasaki is no longer a child, and her place in the world is shifting like silk on polished wood. You follow her as she walks beneath blossoming cherry trees, head slightly bowed, eyes always seeing more than they reveal. Servants murmur. Neighbors speculate. Marriage, they whisper. A good match, if her quietness doesn't offend. She is sent to marry a distant cousin, a gentle man with political leanings and a fondness for bad jokes. His name is Fujiwara no Nobutaka, but in her diary she rarely calls him anything at all. Their union is polite, short-lived, and shaded with melancholy. Here's your mainstream fact. Murasaki married in her mid-20s, a bit late by Heian standards, and gave birth to a daughter. Within just a few years, she was widowed. Her husband's death left her a single mother in a society where widows had limited options and few protections. You watch her mourn, not loudly, not in public, but in the folds of her clothing and the ink of her diary. She writes about her child, her loneliness, her longing for something unnamed. Her brushstrokes grow sharper, the lines of her poems more precise, and behind the words, a woman slowly, steadily refusing to vanish. She begins reading more Chinese texts again. At night, by candlelight, she copies Buddhist scriptures for spiritual merit, and perhaps also to feel some control. Her handwriting becomes admired. Her poems start appearing in private collections. People begin to ask, who is she? But still, she remains just a lady of the Fujiwara house, A shadow in the margins, a whisper, until the summons comes. The imperial court wants her, not as a poet yet, as a lady-in-waiting, an observer, an ornament, a woman to fill the silence beside a very young empress. And Murasaki accepts. Here's your quirky tidbit. She was brought to court under a cloud of mild controversy. Some sources suggest she didn't want the position. Others say she was mocked for her seriousness, nicknamed the gloomy one by more fashionable courtiers. Her wit, they said, was too dry. Her robes too understated. Her smile too rare. Perfect. You arrive with her at the Heian Palace, a maze of corridors and perfumed breezes, where no one walks quickly and everyone listens too hard. The air smells like sandalwood and expectation. Robes rustle like river water. Everyone is watching everyone, and no one says what they mean. You try not to trip on the hem of your formal gown. Historians still argue whether she was selected purely for her talents, or whether the political pull of her family greased the process. Some say she was meant to be a tutor. Others say she was chosen as a calming presence for the Empress Shoshi. Either way, she arrives armed not with weapons, but with ink, patience, and that unblinking gaze. She unrolls her paper quietly, sets her inkstone, adjusts the sleeves of her 12-layered kimono so they won't drag on the floor, and begins watching. Because before she would write Genji, she would study the people who might have inspired him. You sit beside her that night, a flickering oil lamp between you. The garden beyond your screen is filled with frogs, moonlight, and half-written metaphors. She writes a line, frowns, scratches it out, then starts again. This time she writes a man. Beautiful, sad, impossible, a prince, a ghost, a mirror. He smiles on the page, and you realize she's not writing for you. Section 4. The palace breathes in cycles, murmur, ritual, pause, repeat. You adjust quickly, or at least pretend to. Murasaki does more than adjust. She folds herself into the silence like a bookmark slipping between pages, invisible but impossible to forget. You walk the polished corridors with her, following the swish of layered silk. Day begins early here. Incense at dawn, poetry by mid-morning, gossip disguised as fan-fluttering diplomacy by noon. Every gesture is loaded. Every compliment a possible blade. She serves quietly in the court of Empress Shoshi, daughter of a powerful regent. The Empress is young, poised, and thoughtful, still shaping herself like calligraphy drying slowly on parchment. Murasaki becomes her tutor, her scribe, her sounding board. She listens, advises, occasionally sighs. Here's your mainstream fact. Empress Shoshi, also known as Akiko, was positioned as a cultural counterpoint to her rival consort, Empress Teishi. Each empress gathered her own circle of literary and artistic talent to solidify her influence at court. Murasaki's presence wasn't just personal, it was political. She never intended to be a pawn, but her ink had power, and others noticed. You sit with her behind the curtain, literally, as Heian court etiquette placed women behind screens during many formal gatherings. She watches the nobles banter and trade verses, watches the men forget she's there, watches the women remember, and she writes. In her diary, she documents their vanities and kindnesses, their graceful sleeves and less graceful schemes. She doesn't name everyone, but she doesn't have to. You can hear the smirk between her lines. One entry quietly mocks a fellow court lady who prefers admiration to insight, and whose poetry tends toward decorative echoes. Murasaki is not cruel, just precise. Here's your quirky tidbit. Heian ladies kept personal diaries known as Nikki, blending poetry with social commentary. Murasaki's diary is one of the few that survives with a recognizable voice, sarcastic, melancholic, and sharp as a hairpin. You read over her shoulder one afternoon. She scribbled something beautiful, then immediately crossed it out. She leans her chin on one hand and stares out at the garden. Too dramatic, she murmurs. The next version is quieter, but it cuts deeper. Time at court moves strangely, anchored by festivals and poetry contests. You attend one beside her, forced to endure an entire afternoon of forced metaphors about dew, longing, and chrysanthemums. Murasaki says nothing, but later that night in her diary she writes, "So many blossoms and yet no scent. Burn." Still, her presence begins to draw admiration, quietly. The Empress leans on her counsel. The other ladies begin to ask her advice on verses and love letters. One bold courtier slips her a compliment in the form of a poem comparing her to a moon hidden behind elegant clouds. She does not reply. You ask why. She shrugs. The moon prefers solitude. Historians still argue whether Murasaki enjoyed court life or merely endured it, whether she saw herself as a participant or a recorder. But her diary suggests both, that even within the layers of ritual, she found a strange drifting intimacy. You walk with her past a corridor filled with spring light. She stops, stares for a long time at a blossoming branch just outside the screen, and whispers, "He'd pause here." You ask who. She says nothing. But in her eyes, a certain fictional prince has started taking shape. Evening settles like ink across the palace, quiet, fluid, and deliberate. You move through a garden soaked in moonlight, where frogs croak like old court musicians, and the scent of plum blossoms clings to your sleeves. Murasaki walks just ahead, lantern in hand, light flickering against the curve of her cheek. You're beginning to recognize the rhythms of her silence. By day, she tutors Empress Shoshi in Chinese literature, composes court poetry, and listens carefully to things no one else bothers to record. By night, she writes. Not letters, not reports, but something else, something that doesn't quite have a name yet. You sit beside her on the floor of her quarters, her robes loosened, her hair unbound, her brush moving slowly across the page. It's not for the Empress, not for the court. It's for the story. And he is finally speaking. He, of course, is Genji. Here's your mainstream fact. The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century, is widely considered the world's first novel. It follows the romantic and political entanglements of a nobleman, Hikaru Genji, the Shining Prince, with psychological nuance unmatched in pre-modern literature. But tonight he's just a line on a page. A man glimpsed through mist, a melancholy sigh in human form. Handsome, of course. Too handsome. Complicated and destined for ruin. You lean in as she rereads a passage. She frowns, scratches out a word, tries another. She's not interested in heroes. She wants to know how they falter, where they pause, what they regret in the middle of the night. Some of the court ladies begin to ask what she's writing. She calls it fiction, a story, just an indulgence. But they press. So she reads aloud one evening, behind a screen, to a half-circle of silk-draped listeners. No one breathes, because Genji walks into their lives like he's always belonged there. And suddenly, everyone wants more. Here's your quirky tidbit. Genji wasn't written all at once. It unfolded in installments, passed from hand to hand in partial scrolls. Readers eagerly awaited the next chapter, and some even sent suggestions or critiques to Murasaki through intermediaries, like ancient fan mail. You attend one of these late-night readings. The women gasp at Genji's charm, giggle at his romantic failures, sigh at his sorrow. Murasaki barely reacts. She simply watches their reactions, storing every blush, every laugh, every held breath. And then she writes more. Historians still argue whether Murasaki meant to create such a sprawling epic, whether she intended Genji to become a mirror to the entire Heian world, or if it just happened, one chapter at a time, carried by ink and insomnia. You sit with her well past midnight. Her brush lifts, a line forms. Genji falls in love again, unwisely. You smile. You've seen this before. You've seen it happen in court, in gardens, in glances, and now in fiction it finally has room to breathe. You wake to birdsong, faint and hollow through the shoji screens. The palace is stirring. Courtiers glide down polished corridors like shadows in lacquer. Servants whisper. The spring air smells faintly of ink dust and plum petals pressed between pages. Murasaki has already been up for hours. She's seated in the Empress's private salon, legs tucked neatly beneath her, as another poem is being composed across the room. This one isn't hers. It belongs to a rival court lady, draped in robes dyed just a shade too bold. The theme of today's poetry circle, love lost before it was found. Murasaki listens, smiles politely, and then, when invited, responds with her own verse. It's subtle, delicate, almost too quiet to notice, but it lands like a whisper inside a shout. You glance around. A few eyebrows rise, a single fan snaps closed a little too sharply. Court life, you're learning, that is a battlefield with no swords, only brushstrokes and layered silk. Here's your mainstream fact. Heian court culture revolved around poetic skill. Nearly every occasion, births, romances, deaths, even weather observations, demanded a suitable waka, 31-syllable poem. A well-crafted verse could make or break reputations, advance a romance, or earn quiet envy for years. Murasaki isn't flashy, but her poems always cut to the bone, wrapped in blossoms and regret. You walk with her later down the eastern corridor, where the lanterns burn low and the scent of cedar oil lingers. She leans slightly toward you and murmurs. She rhymed autumn rain with again, twice. You both try not to laugh. But even within the sharp games of poetry and politeness, Murasaki feels the pressure rising. Genji has grown. Scroll by scroll, he spreads. The courtiers whisper about the story. Some wonder who it's really about. A few think it's them. One man gifts her a fan with pressed violets and the line, "My soul follows your brush." She sends it back. Here's your quirky tidbit. Literary gossip in the Heian court was so intense that several characters in the Tale of Genji were believed to be thinly veiled caricatures of real courtiers. Murasaki never confirmed or denied. She simply kept writing, letting the story weave tighter around their suspicions. You find her one afternoon pacing the veranda, scroll in hand, lips moving silently. She's rehearsing, not a performance, just the cadence of a passage she's unsure of. A conversation between Genji and a woman he'll almost love, but not quite. She adjusts a line. Then again, then again. Too much moon, she mutters. You suggest fog. She nods. Historians still argue whether Murasaki's depiction of love was idealistic or deeply cynical, whether Genji is meant to be admired or pitied, but you suspect she never intended to moralize. She simply wrote what she saw: longing, elegance, miscommunication, and the quiet ache of passing time. That night, another chapter is finished. She rolls the scroll tightly, seals it with a crimson cord, and sends it into the night by messenger. You sit beside the candle's dying glow, watching her eyes linger on the space where ink used to be. Genji, for now, rests. Dawn arrives with a hush rather than a flare, the way it always seems to in Heian, Kyoto. The morning mist doesn't so much lift as exhale, curling along veranda steps and the corners of silk drapery. You trail behind Murasaki as she moves quietly toward the Empress's pavilion, sleeves whispering with each step. By now, she has become a fixture, equal parts presence and mystery. Courtiers lower their voices when she passes. Some bow slightly. A few avoid her entirely, unsure whether her silence means disapproval or observation. It usually means both. Today she's bringing a new installment of Genji to Empress Shoshi, not with pomp, not with fanfare, just a scroll wrapped in violet silk. You sit beside her as Shoshi unrolls it, eyes scanning the lines with careful, almost reverent attention. A small smile, a pause at a particularly mournful phrase, a breath that catches unspoken. Then the scroll is rolled back up, pressed to the Empress's chest, and set aside like something precious. Here's your mainstream fact. Murasaki Shikibu was not merely a tutor to the Empress. She became a cultural mainstay at court, with the Tale of Genji elevating both her literary status and the prestige of the salon around Shoshi. The work became a form of influence, one scroll at a time. Later that morning, you walk the gardens with Murasaki. She seems distracted, not withdrawn, just full. Her thoughts ripple just beneath the surface, like koi in a deep pond. She stops beneath a pine tree and gazes at the horizon. I'm not sure where he should go next, she murmurs. Genji? She nods. He's restless, but also tired. You almost laugh. You just described every man at court, she finally smiles. As you stroll past the lotus pond, you ask her how she plans the story, whether she outlines the chapters or lets Genji decide. I wait, she says, until he makes a mistake, then I follow it. You sit together under the trees, watching the petals fall. She sketches a few notes in the margin of her sleeve with a charcoal stub. A character will be introduced soon. Young, brilliant, doomed. She doesn't know yet how he will fail. Only that he must. Here's your quirky tidbit. Murasaki's own diary makes it clear she sometimes disliked writing, or at least felt burdened by its pace and its reception. She once wrote that she wished to withdraw from court entirely, to live quietly and anonymously, but felt compelled to stay. Historians still argue whether Murasaki shaped Genji as a romantic ideal or a cautionary tale. But as she watches those petals drift, you suspect it's neither. She's writing not to explain people, but to sit beside them, to witness their beauty and confusion without offering resolution. That night, back in her room, she opens the next scroll. The candlelight flickers, the brush hovers, she writes one line, then stops, then writes another. Genji meets a woman in the dark. He does not ask her name, and somehow that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The days stretch long, like the sleeves of the women who drift across the palace corridors. Time in the Heian court is both rigid and dreamlike, measured by festivals, moon viewings, poetry contests, and the bloom and fall rhythm of flowers that nobody truly forgets. You spend your morning in the Empress's salon again, but Murasaki barely speaks today. She's listening, really listening, to a pair of court ladies composing verses about autumn dew and impermanence. Their laughter is light, practiced, their rhymes deliberate, but Murasaki's gaze is somewhere else, on a scroll, on a character, on a prince who will soon outlive his youth. You lean closer. "He's getting older," she says quietly. You glance around, unsure who she means. But of course, it's Genji. He has grown in the pages just as you've grown beside her. He's loved too much, lost too often, and now, as Murasaki's brush lingers, he begins to feel it in his bones. Here's your mainstream fact. The second half of the Tale of Genji is notably more somber than the first. As Genji ages, the narrative shifts, less about romantic conquests and more about spiritual longing, grief, and the realization that beauty fades even in a perfect court. That shift is happening now. You walk the garden with her at dusk, the gravel crunching softly under your feet. She points to a chrysanthemum heavy with rainwater, its petals folding inward. "That's how he looks now," she says. You don't need to ask who. Later that evening, she returns to her writing mat, her sleeves tucked neatly behind her, brush poised above the paper like a dancer before the first step. The room is quiet except for the occasional pop of the oil lamp. Genji is remembering. He's remembering a girl he once passed in a corridor and never spoke to. He's remembering a letter he meant to send and didn't. He's remembering the sound of a flute played badly by someone he loved briefly. You listen to her breathe between lines. She's aging with him. Here's your quirky tidbit. Murasaki sometimes inserted poems into her prose that could stand alone as miniatures of feeling. Many of them echo Buddhist themes: regret, transience, karmic entanglement. One scholar once called Genji a novel written by a poet meditating on memory. Historians still argue whether Murasaki intended Genji to evolve with age, or whether she simply evolved while writing it. The character and his creator are nearly inseparable by now. You feel her exhaustion, not of the body, but of knowing too much about longing. You close the scroll with her that night. The chapter is finished. Genji has left the temple, having said nothing to the monk who reminded him of his younger self. The silence was the point. Murasaki sighs. You ask if she's tired of him yet. She shakes her head. But he's growing quieter, she whispers. And then she snuffs the lamp, leaving only moonlight and memory. You wake to the sound of distant bells, temple chimes echoing faintly across Kyoto's morning mist. It's cooler today. The light has sharpened. Autumn is almost here, and the court feels it in their bones. Layered robes shift to darker hues. Incense grows heavier, more contemplative. And the laughter? It softens, like silk being folded away. Murasaki moves more slowly now, or maybe it's the weight of everything she's written. Genji is no longer the only character who haunts the pages. Others are rising, sons, daughters, shadows of past choices. And always the women. You sit with her in her quarters as she leafs through an older scroll. She rereads a scene she wrote months ago. A woman is writing a farewell poem. She knows she's dying. No one else does. She presses the note into a sleeve and smiles at someone who will never understand the message. Murasaki touches the parchment, gently, like it might bruise. Here's your mainstream fact. Many of the women in the Tale of Genji experience quiet suffering, trapped in political marriages, abandoned after affairs, or forced into religious retreat. Murasaki's portrayal of their inner lives was groundbreaking, suggesting empathy that few male writers of the time offered. You ask if she based them on real people. She shrugs. Everyone's a fragment. You think about all the women you've seen in the palace, serving tea with eyes full of storms, reciting poems while hiding bruised pride, composing letters they'll never send. Maybe Genji isn't the point. Maybe they are. Later that day, word spreads. Another lady has left court life to become a nun. Too much scandal. Too many whispers. You pass Murasaki by the koi pond, watching a single red leaf spin in circles on the water's surface. She loved him, she says. You ask who. She's not in the story, she replies. But maybe she will be. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some modern scholars believe that Genji's most tragic female characters weren't just fictional. They were quiet critiques of the Heian court's treatment of women. Murasaki, through fiction, may have been holding up a mirror few wanted to face. Historians still argue whether her novel is a romance, a tragedy, or a political allegory. But as you watch her return to her writing mat that night, you realize it doesn't have to choose. She dips her brush. Genji dreams of a woman's voice but cannot place the face. She dips it again. A woman burns a letter in secret but saves the ashes in a painted jar. Again. A young girl joins the court, unaware that she'll grow into heartbreak. You say nothing. You just sit beside her, candlelight flickering across the scroll, and realize you're watching a woman write the entire interior world of a generation into existence. The palace is quieter these days, not silent, just muffled, like a poem recited behind a screen. You walk the shaded corridors with Murasaki and feel the shift, not in the architecture, but in the atmosphere. Something has turned. The tale is well known now. The scrolls pass hands before they're even dry. Court ladies clutch new chapters like gifts. Emissaries request copies for distant provinces. Someone says the emperor's cousin reads it aloud during moon viewing nights, his voice trembling at the sad parts. You catch Murasaki watching them, these admirers, these wide-eyed readers, with the peculiar expression of someone both flattered and faintly horrified. She never meant to be popular. Not like this. Here's your mainstream fact. The Tale of Genji achieved remarkable acclaim during Murasaki's lifetime, something rare for a woman author in a patriarchal court. It was copied by hand dozens of times, recited aloud in salons, and referenced in other poems and letters almost immediately. But praise doesn't always bring peace. Murasaki finds herself more noticed now. Her poems are read with extra scrutiny. Her robes are observed more closely. Her silences, once respected, are now dissected like verses. "Everyone wants to know what I meant," she mutters one afternoon. "Isn't that good?" you ask. She raises an eyebrow. "Sometimes I don't know what I meant." You attend a gathering one evening where a group of men debate the meaning of a recent Genji chapter. They argue over metaphors. Discuss whether Genji's longing for a particular woman is romantic or inappropriate. They speak confidently, all while Murasaki sits behind a screen, sipping tea unnoticed. She leans toward you. "I was just describing a breeze." You snort into your cup. "Here's your quirky tidbit. Because women weren't supposed to claim public authorship, Murasaki's name doesn't appear on the original Genji manuscripts. Even centuries later, some scholars debated whether she was the true author or a figurehead for a team of writers. Today, nearly all agree the voice was hers. Too distinct, too consistent to be shared. Still, you feel her detaching just a little. The scrolls grow longer. The themes grow heavier. Genji begins to falter, not just in love, but in spirit. He wanders, withdraws, regrets. Murasaki mirrors him in her own way. She writes alone more often now, behind closed shutters, her sleeves shorter, her hair loosely bound. She keeps her diary but locks it away more carefully. You sit beside her as she finishes a chapter where Genji visits a temple and hears distant music from a woman he'll never meet. He listens. He leaves. That's it. "Too quiet?" she asks. You shake your head. "Then I'll leave it," she says. Historians still argue whether Genji's melancholy reflected Murasaki's own, or whether it was simply the natural arc of an aging character. But as she leans back and closes her eyes, you understand the truth she never says aloud. She's writing toward silence, toward the end. And though the readers clamor for more, she's already started saying goodbye. The seasons shift again. Autumn gold curling into winter white. Snow drapes the palace rooftops like forgotten silk, and the air sharpens with the bite of distant mountain wind. You walk beside Murasaki beneath a gray sky, your breath soft clouds, your footsteps muffled in the snow-dusted gravel. She doesn't complain about the cold. She rarely complains at all. Instead, she observes. Two servants brush the walkway ahead of her, trying to remove leaves that are no longer there. A pair of courtiers argue over robe layers too light for the season. She watches it all quietly, storing it the way she stores everything, gently, precisely, with ink at the ready. Back in her room, she unwraps a scroll tied in violet ribbon. The paper is new. Her brush is trimmed just right. Her hand trembles, not from age, but from knowing what comes next. Genji is dying. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, with the weary weight of someone who has loved too much and learned too late. Here's your mainstream fact. In the latter chapters of the Tale of Genji, the Shining Prince becomes more introspective, melancholy, and withdrawn. The tone of the novel shifts from romantic intrigue to spiritual reflection, mirroring Buddhist themes of impermanence and the transience of beauty. Murasaki writes the chapter as if exhaling a long-held breath. You sit beside her in silence as she pens Genji's final days. His thoughts wander toward old gardens, old letters, old songs sung by women whose faces blur now in memory. He doesn't make grand declarations. He simply fades. So does the chapter. So does the brushstroke. Later, a courtier reads the new scroll aloud, tears forming at the edges of her eyes. Another sighs dramatically. One says nothing, but sends Murasaki a folded poem later that evening. How cruel to make me mourn a man I never met. She sets it aside. You ask how it feels. To end him. She replies, I didn't end him. He ended himself. You wonder if that's true. Here's your quirky tidbit. After Genji's death, the tale of Genji continues, but without him. The final chapters, sometimes referred to as the Uji chapters, follow his descendants and their entangled fates. Some scholars believe these were added later. Others insist they were Murasaki's final literary gesture, a meditation on legacy and the stories left behind. Historians still argue whether she intended Genji to be mourned or merely remembered, whether his absence is the novel's true climax or its most poignant silence. But Murasaki? She doesn't need to decide. She simply cleans her brush, rolls the scroll, and lets him go. That night, as snow gathers gently outside, she lights a single candle and gazes into its flicker. You sit nearby, not speaking, because you both understand sometimes grief is the most honest form of art. The snow lingers, though thinner now, melting in soft trickles from the corners of eaves. The palace grounds feel quieter still, as though even the buildings are holding their breath. You trail Murasaki through the colonnades, past shuttered screens and sleeping gardens, and for once no one interrupts her. Not because they don't see her, but because they know what she's done. The tale has become something more than literature now. It's a mirror. A confession, a season they can't stop rereading. Scrolls are copied and recopied, brushstrokes trailing across page after page like veins. You pass a scribe who's transcribed the same chapter 3 times. He bows as she walks by. She barely notices. You ask her, later, if she ever rereads the older parts. Sometimes, she says, they feel like someone else wrote them. A younger version of me, braver in some ways, more dramatic. She smiles faintly, and more romantic. The court is beginning to change around her. Some of her peers have left, retired to temples, married off, faded into the footnotes of court gossip. Even Empress Shoshi, though still held in esteem, speaks more often of prayer and legacy than politics or verse. Murasaki writes less now, not because she has nothing to say, but because she's learning to say it more quietly. Here's your mainstream fact. Murasaki Shikibu continued to serve at court for many years after completing the core of the Tale of Genji. Her later diary entries grow increasingly contemplative, focusing less on daily court life and more on personal reflections and spiritual matters. She often retreats to a small veranda near the rear of the Empress's residence. You sit beside her as she watches the bare trees sway in the wind. She says nothing for a long time. Then, I used to write to understand what might happen. And now? Now I write to remember what already has. You find one of her early poems tucked inside an unused scroll. It's short, spare, just a few characters. It speaks of a dream she once had, someone calling her name, just beyond the edge of dawn. She doesn't remember the voice, only the feeling. You tuck it back where it belongs. Here's your quirky tidbit. Though Murasaki is best known for Genji, she also left behind over 100 short poems, many of which are preserved in imperial anthologies. A few express loneliness, others wonder whether her work will be remembered at all. One haunting line reads, "If my brush should fall, will my name go with it?" Historians still argue whether Murasaki faded into obscurity after her literary peak, or whether she chose a quieter life by intention. Some say she continued writing in secret. Others believe she found peace in stillness, her story already told. You walk with her one last time along the garden path. The koi are slower now, half asleep beneath the ice. The trees are bare, but still standing. She rests her hand on the trunk of an old plum tree and closes her eyes. I thought I was writing about him, she says, but I was writing about all of us. And then she walks back inside. The ink dries, the scrolls are stored, and the story, while finished, still lingers in the air like perfume in winter. The days grow shorter still, and now you notice that the quiet around Murasaki is no longer just emotional, it's structural. Fewer footsteps echo through the corridors, fewer voices rise in the salons. You pass tapestries taken down for cleaning that never seem to be rehung. The palace is aging, and so is she. But not in the way that frightens her, not physically. She still walks the garden paths, still tucks her sleeves with exactness, still sharpens her brush with a steady hand. What changes is her need to be seen. You find her one afternoon kneeling over a scroll, not writing Genji now, but copying Buddhist scripture in careful, reverent lines. The work is meditative, intentional, not meant to be shared. You kneel beside her and she nods without looking up. It's quieter this way, she says. Here's your mainstream fact. In her later years, Murasaki turned increasingly toward spiritual pursuits, likely influenced by the growing Buddhist movement at court that emphasized impermanence and withdrawal. Copying sutras was both a religious offering and a personal comfort, a final way to shape words without vanity. She still teaches from time to time, still answers a poetic challenge with grace and deadly precision. But she no longer seeks the spotlight, if she ever truly did. You walk the southern corridor with her, where sun filters in through wooden slats and catches the floating dust just right. She stops beside a half-open shoji screen and listens. You hear it, she says. You pause. Wind through old paper, she murmurs, like someone turning pages. Her diary entries shift tone. Once filled with witty asides and poetic takedowns, they become more reflective. She worries about her daughter's future. She wonders aloud whether Genji will be preserved correctly. She muses on whether she was too harsh in judgment, not of others, of herself. You ask her if she'd rewrite anything. She chuckles. Almost everything. But that's what makes it worth keeping. Here's your quirky tidbit. The Genji Monogatari manuscript we know today is likely incomplete. Scholars debate which parts were lost, added, or redacted over time. Some believe Murasaki intended a different ending. Others argue she always meant to leave the tale with echoes rather than closure. Historians still argue over how much of Genji was shaped by Murasaki's personal life and how much was invention. But when you watch her now, still alert, brushing fine lines of ink into silence, you realize it doesn't matter. Because either way, it's hers. All of it. The characters, the longing, the ache that never quite speaks its name. She finishes the sutra for the day and sets it aside. Her eyes close not from weariness, but from fullness. And for a moment you see her not as a court lady or a writer or even as the ghost of literature past. You see her as she is now, a woman in twilight, surrounded by words she no longer needs to say. You don't know when it happens exactly, but one morning you wake and realize that the scrolls are no longer scattered across her writing mat. The inkstone sits undisturbed. Her sleeves are folded neatly atop a cedar chest. The brush, her faithful companion for so many years, lies wrapped in cloth. Murasaki hasn't stopped writing, she's just stepped away from the page. You find her seated in the inner courtyard, where a lone camellia tree still clings to its last few blossoms. She's watching a bird bath in the stone basin, water rippling outward in slow, shimmering circles. No rush, no worry, just breath and observation. She smiles faintly when she sees you. I dreamed of rain last night, she says. You nod, unsure whether it means sorrow or change, or maybe just rain. Here's your mainstream fact. Records of Murasaki Shikibu's final years are vague. Most scholars agree she lived into her 50s, a respectable age for the period, but there is no clear account of her death. Her departure from court life was quiet, gradual, and undocumented, much like her entrance. People still ask about her. Some wonder if she's writing in secret. Others say she's taken vows, retreating to a temple in the hills. A few whisper that she's wandered into the story itself, lost among the characters she created. You sit with her again that afternoon. She brings out one last scroll. Not Genji, not a diary, but a personal collection of poems. She doesn't read them aloud. She simply rolls them out and lets you see. One speaks of wind, one speaks of memory, One speaks of watching someone you love walk away, knowing you'll never see them again, but wishing them warmth, always. She doesn't ask what you think. She knows. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Japan today, Murasaki Shikibu is honored not just as an author, but as a cultural icon. Shrines, museums, and literary prizes bear her name, and yet she herself may have doubted her legacy. In one surviving poem, she writes, "What name will remain when the ink has dried?" Historians still argue what parts of her life were real and what parts were reshaped by admiration. But even they agree, no other court lady left such a deep impression, not by sword or scandal, but by story. You follow her to the garden gate, where the wind carries the scent of dry leaves and old cedar. She pauses, closes her eyes, and says, "I don't need to be remembered. Just read." You bow and step back. She turns, her sleeves catching a final drift of afternoon light, and disappears beyond the curtain. The story isn't over. It's simply returned to silence. You don't know when it happens exactly, but one morning you wake and realize that the scrolls are no longer scattered across her writing mat. The inkstone sits undisturbed. Her sleeves are folded neatly atop a cedar chest. The brush, her faithful companion for so many years, lies wrapped in cloth. Murasaki hasn't stopped writing. She's just stepped away from the page. You find her seated in the inner courtyard, where a lone camellia tree still clings to its last few blossoms. She's watching a bird bathe in the stone basin, water rippling outward in slow, shimmering circles. No rush, no worry, just breath and observation. She smiles faintly when she sees you. "I dreamed of rain last night," she says. You nod, unsure whether it means sorrow or change, or maybe just rain. Here's your mainstream fact. Records of Murasaki Shikibu's final years are vague. Most scholars agree she lived into her 50s, a respectable age for the period. But there is no clear account of her death. Her departure from court life was quiet, gradual, and undocumented, much like her entrance. People still ask about her. Some wonder if she's writing in secret. Others say she's taken vows, retreating to a temple in the hills. A few whisper that she's wandered into the story itself, lost among the characters she created. You sit with her again that afternoon. She brings out one last scroll, not Genji, not a diary, but a personal collection of poems. She doesn't read them aloud, she simply rolls them out and lets you see. One speaks of wind, one speaks of memory, one speaks of watching someone you love walk away, knowing you'll never see them again, but wishing them warmth always. She doesn't ask what you think. She knows. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Japan today, Murasaki Shikibu is honored not just as an author, but as a cultural icon. Shrines, museums, and literary prizes bear her name, and yet she herself may have doubted her legacy. In one surviving poem, she writes, "What name will remain when the ink has dried?" Historians still argue what parts of her life were real and what parts were reshaped by admiration. But even they agree, no other court lady left such a deep impression, not by sword or scandal, but by story. You follow her to the garden gate, where the wind carries the scent of dry leaves and old cedar. She pauses, closes her eyes, and says, "I don't need to be remembered. Just read." You bow and step back. She turns, her sleeves catching a final drift of afternoon light, and disappears beyond the curtain. The story isn't over. It's simply returned to silence. Awaiting continue.